In the stagnant darkness of a night, a forgotten shed holds the smell of rust and dust. A police officer, tied up and covered in marks, is thrown between old boxes. His breathing is short, and the rope cuts into his wrists as he tries to understand how he ended up there. He breaks the silence with a single, quick scream echoing through the empty walls. Outside, the rigid sound of paws approaches on the wet cement. The animal stops in front of the door, ear raised. The scent fixed in the air. The officer, helpless, falls to his knees. The wooden ceiling creaks as if someone is moving above him. Then, the breath of seconds stretches time, and everything becomes a suspended wait. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thanks for joining us. Now, back to our story. Detective Jake Morrison's consciousness surfaced slowly, like emerging from deep water. His head throbbed with a dull ache that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The metallic taste in his mouth and the disorientation told him this wasn't just sleep he was waking from. As awareness crept back, he realized he couldn't move his arms. Panic shot through him as he discovered thick rope binding his wrists behind his back, his ankles similarly secured to what felt like a metal chair. The darkness around him was nearly complete, broken only by thin slivers of light that filtered through gaps in what appeared to be boarded windows high above. The air was stale and heavy with the scent of rust, old wood, and something else he couldn't quite identify. As his eyes adjusted, Jake began to make out the shadowy outlines of his surroundings. He was in some kind of warehouse or storage facility, surrounded by towering stacks of wooden crates and abandoned equipment covered in dust sheets. His police training kicked in despite the fog in his mind. Stay calm, assess the situation, look for opportunities, but first, he needed to remember how he'd gotten here. The last clear memory he had was walking to his patrol car after his shift at the Detroit Metropolitan Police Department's 15th precinct. He'd been reviewing case files in his mind, particularly the corruption investigation he'd been quietly working on. Then nothing until this moment. The silence in the warehouse was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of traffic that seemed miles away. Jake tested the ropes binding him, finding them professionally tied with little give. Whoever had brought him here knew what they were doing. This wasn't some random kidnapping or robbery gone wrong. Someone had planned this carefully. As he struggled to piece together the events leading to his captivity, Jake's throat felt parched and raw. The taste of whatever had been used to drug him lingered unpleasantly. He estimated he'd been unconscious for hours, possibly since the previous evening. The thought of his partner Rex waiting for him at home filled him with both worry and hope. The German Shepherd was more than just his canine partner. Rex was family. "Hello?" Jake's voice cracked as he called out, the sound echoing in the vast space. "Is anyone there?" The words seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, returning to him as hollow echoes that emphasized his isolation. He tried again, louder this time, his voice carrying the authority he'd developed over 12 years on the force. "I'm a police officer. You're making a serious mistake." But even as he spoke the words, Jake suspected this was no mistake. The location was too remote, too carefully chosen. The professional quality of his restraints, the isolation of the warehouse, everything pointed to this being exactly what someone had intended. The question that gnawed at him was who, and more importantly, why. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Jake worked at his bindings and tried to make sense of his situation. The warehouse showed signs of recent use despite its abandoned appearance. Fresh tire tracks in the dust, areas where crates had been recently moved, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke that hadn't yet dissipated completely. Someone had been using this place as more than just a storage facility. The sound of his own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Jake forced himself to remain calm, using breathing techniques he'd learned during his academy training. Panic would only cloud his judgment, and right now he needed to think clearly. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to bring him here alive, which meant they wanted something from him: information, leverage, or perhaps to send a message to others. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound that made his heart race with hope. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint echo of barking. It was distinctive, urgent, and achingly familiar. Rex had found him. The barking grew closer, more insistent. Jake knew that sound. It was Rex's alert bark, the one he used when he'd located what he was searching for during investigations. Despite his training to remain quiet during operations, Jake couldn't help himself. "Rex! Here, boy! I'm here!" His voice carried through the warehouse with desperate urgency. The barking stopped for a moment, then resumed with even greater intensity, much closer now. Jake could hear the sound of claws scrambling against metal, then the distinctive sound of Rex forcing his way through what sounded like a loose board or broken window. The silence that followed seemed eternal. Then, from somewhere in the shadows behind him, Jake heard the soft padding of paws on concrete. A wet nose touched his bound hands, followed by the familiar warmth of Rex's body pressing against his legs. The relief was overwhelming. "Good boy, Rex. Good boy," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you find me?" The German Shepherd whined softly, circling the chair and sniffing at the ropes. Rex had always been exceptionally intelligent, but finding him here in what appeared to be an abandoned industrial area, far from their usual territory, seemed almost impossible. Rex began to explore the immediate area around Jake's chair, his nose working methodically across the floor. Even in the dim light, Jake could see his partner's focused behavior. This wasn't just a reunion. Rex was working, following scents and investigating their surroundings with the same thoroughness he showed on official searches. The warehouse fell silent again, except for the soft sounds of Rex's investigation. Jake tried to process what his presence here meant. Rex had somehow tracked him across what must have been considerable distance. Either the dog had witnessed something during the kidnapping, or he'd followed a scent trail that had led him here. Both possibilities suggested that whoever had taken Jake had made mistakes, left evidence behind. "What do you smell, boy?" Jake asked quietly. Rex paused in his sniffing and looked back at him, then resumed his methodical search pattern. The dog's behavior suggested he was finding more than just Jake's scent. There were other smells here, other people who had been in this warehouse recently. As Rex continued his investigation, Jake became aware of other details about their location. The warehouse was larger than he'd initially realized, with multiple levels and what appeared to be several exits. Some of the crates around them bore shipping labels, though he couldn't make out the details in the poor light, but their arrangement seemed deliberate, creating pathways and hiding places throughout the space. The sound of Rex suddenly stopping his investigation made Jake tense. The dog had frozen in position about 20 feet away, his body language alert and focused on something Jake couldn't see. A low growl rumbled in Rex's throat, not aggressive, but warning. Someone or something else was in the warehouse with them. Rex's growl intensified as he remained frozen in position, his attention fixed on something beyond Jake's line of sight. The German Shepherd's ears were pricked forward, every muscle in his body taut with alertness. Jake held his breath, straining to hear whatever had caught his partner's attention. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. After what felt like an eternity, Rex relaxed slightly and resumed his investigation, but with more caution now. He moved in a wider circle around Jake's position, occasionally pausing to sniff more intensely at particular spots on the concrete floor. The dog's behavior told Jake that while there might be no immediate threat, Rex had definitely detected signs of recent human presence. "What is it, boy? "What did you find?" Jake whispered, trying to keep his voice low while still communicating with his partner. Rex glanced back at him briefly before continuing his methodical search pattern. The dog was clearly in work mode. Following protocols they'd practiced countless times during their 5 years as partners. As his eyes continued to adjust to the dim lighting, Jake began to notice more details about their surroundings. The warehouse wasn't completely abandoned as he'd first thought. While dust covered most surfaces, there were areas where it had been recently disturbed. Footprints were visible in some of the dustier sections, and not just from his own arrival. Multiple people had been moving through this space regularly. Rex suddenly stopped at a pile of what looked like discarded clothing near a stack of crates. His tail went rigid, and he began pawing at something in the pile. From his limited vantage point, Jake could see his partner had found what appeared to be pieces of fabric, but the specific details remained frustratingly out of view. "Bring it here, Rex. Show me what you found." Jake kept his voice calm and authoritative, using the tone Rex recognized from their training sessions. The German Shepherd carefully picked up something in his mouth and trotted back to Jake's chair. What he dropped at Jake's feet made his blood run cold. It was a fragment of dark blue fabric with a distinctive silver button still attached. Police uniform material. But not just any police uniform. Jake recognized the specific style and button configuration used by the Detroit Metropolitan Police Department. Someone from his own department had been here, and recently enough that Rex could still detect their scent. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. This wasn't a random kidnapping by outside criminals. Someone within the police department was involved, someone who had access to information about his movements. His investigation, perhaps even his home address, the corruption he'd been quietly investigating, went deeper than he'd suspected. Rex returned to the pile of clothing, this time emerging with what looked like a partially burned piece of paper. He brought it to Jake, dropping it carefully where Jake could see it despite his restraints. Even in the poor light, Jake could make out fragments of official letterhead and what appeared to be case numbers. Someone had tried to destroy documents here, but hadn't been thorough enough. "Good boy, Rex. Keep searching." Jake's mind raced as he tried to process these discoveries. The warehouse wasn't just a hiding place. It was being used as some kind of meeting point or storage facility for sensitive materials. The burned papers suggested that whoever was using this location was destroying evidence on a regular basis. Rex continued his systematic search. Moving further away from Jake's position, the dog's nose led him to areas where the dust patterns suggested frequent foot traffic. Near what appeared to be a makeshift table created from stacked crates, Rex paused and began pawing at the ground. His behavior indicated he'd found something significant. From somewhere in the shadows, beyond Rex's position, came the sound of paper rustling. Rex had discovered more documents, and from his excited behavior, these hadn't been destroyed. Jake watched as his partner carefully gathered several papers in his mouth and brought them back. The pages were official-looking forms and what appeared to be financial records, though Jake couldn't read the specific details from his restrained position. The evidence was mounting that this warehouse served as more than just his prison. It was clearly a hub for illegal activities involving members of his own department. The careful way the documents were hidden, the recent signs of use, the police uniform fragment, everything pointed to an organized operation that had been running for some time. Rex's investigation led him to discover a section of the warehouse where crates had been arranged to create a hidden alcove. His barking became more urgent as he explored this area, and Jake could hear the sound of his partner moving boxes and investigating what lay behind them. The German Shepherd's training included detection work, and his current behavior suggested he was finding items that triggered his alert responses. When Rex returned from the hidden area, he was carrying something that made Jake's heart race. It was a set of keys on a familiar keychain, the Detroit PD logo clearly visible even in the dim light. But these weren't just any keys. Jake recognized the specific design of the keychain because he'd seen it every day for the past 3 years. It belonged to Captain Sarah Bennett, his mentor and the person who had recommended him for the corruption investigation in the first place. The discovery sent shockwaves through Jake's understanding of his situation. Captain Bennett had been his strongest supporter throughout his career, the person who had guided him through his detective training and encouraged his investigative instincts. She was scheduled to retire next month after 30 years of distinguished service. The idea that she could be involved in whatever had led to his kidnapping seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. Her keys were here, in this warehouse being used for illegal activities. Rex had found them in an area that showed signs of regular use, not somewhere they could have been dropped accidentally. Someone had been using this location for meetings, document destruction, and storage of sensitive materials, and Captain Bennett was somehow connected to it. Jake's mind raced through the implications. If Captain Bennett was involved, then she had access to his investigation files, his schedule, and detailed knowledge of his methods and vulnerabilities. She would have known exactly how to orchestrate his kidnapping without leaving obvious traces. The professional quality of his restraints and the careful selection of this location suddenly made perfect sense. Rex continued exploring the warehouse, but Jake's attention was now focused on trying to remember every interaction he'd had with Captain Bennett regarding his corruption investigation. Had there been signs he'd missed? Moments when she'd seemed overly interested in his progress or tried to steer him away from certain leads. The sound of Rex's nails clicking on concrete brought Jake back to the present. His partner had discovered what appeared to be a hidden compartment built into the floor beneath some loosely stacked pallets. The German Shepherd was pawing at a section where the concrete seemed different, newer than the surrounding area. His behavior indicated there was something beneath the surface that had caught his attention. As Rex worked to expose whatever lay hidden beneath the false floor section, Jake realized that his situation was far more complex and dangerous than he'd initially believed. This wasn't just about stopping his investigation, it was about protecting a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of his department. Captain Bennett's involvement suggested that the corruption network had been operating under the protection of someone with significant authority and access. The warehouse around them suddenly felt less like a prison and more like the center of a web that extended throughout the Detroit Metropolitan Police Department. Jake understood that if he was going to survive this situation and expose the truth, he would need to be extremely careful about who he trusted. The very people who should be searching for him might be the ones who wanted to ensure he was never found. Rex's persistence with the hidden floor compartment finally paid off as he managed to dislodge what appeared to be a carefully concealed access panel. The sound of metal scraping against concrete echoed through the warehouse as the false section shifted, revealing a cavity beneath. Jake watched with growing anticipation as his partner investigated the opening, his tail wagging with the excitement of discovery. The German Shepherd disappeared briefly into the hidden space before emerging with something substantial in his mouth. As Rex approached with his find, Jake could see it was a waterproof document case, the kind used by the department to protect sensitive files during transport. The case bore official seals and classification markings that were clearly visible even in the dim lighting. "Drop it here, Rex. Let me see what you found." Jake's voice carried a mixture of hope and dread. His partner obediently placed the case within Jake's limited field of vision, though his bound hands prevented him from opening it directly. The label on the case made his stomach drop. Operation Clean Slate, Level 4 Classification, Captain S. Bennett, Authorization Code 7742. Operation Clean Slate was a name Jake had never heard before. Despite his years in the department and his current work on corruption investigations, Level 4 classification was reserved for the most sensitive operations. typically involving federal cooperation or matters of internal security. The fact that Captain Bennett was the authorizing officer on a classified operation he knew nothing about sent chills down his spine. Rex returned to the hidden compartment and emerged with additional items: a small recording device, several flash drives sealed in evidence bags, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. The methodical way these items had been concealed suggested this warehouse served as a secure storage facility for materials too sensitive to keep at official locations. The recording device was partially visible to Jake, and he could see it was a high-end model typically used for covert operations. Red and green indicator lights suggested it contained multiple recordings, and possibly hours of conversations or meetings. The thought that he might be looking at evidence of the very conspiracy he'd been investigating filled him with both excitement and terror. "Rex, check if there's more. Keep searching that area." Jake's training told him that hidden compartments often contained multiple layers of concealment. His partner seemed to understand the urgency in his voice and returned to the opening with renewed enthusiasm. Within minutes, Rex had uncovered what appeared to be a larger cache of materials. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of files bearing the names of Detroit police officers, city officials, and prominent business leaders. Even from his restricted vantage point, Jake could see photographs clipped to many of the files, along with what appeared to be financial records and personal information. The scope of the material suggested surveillance and intelligence gathering on a massive scale. Among the files, Jake spotted his own name on a thick folder that made his blood run cold. Someone had been building a comprehensive dossier on him, documenting his career, his investigation methods, his personal relationships, and even his daily routines. The level of detail suggested months or possibly years of surveillance. They knew everything about him, which explained how they'd been able to orchestrate his kidnapping so precisely. Rex continued extracting materials from the hidden space, and with each discovery, the magnitude of the conspiracy became clearer. Financial ledgers showed large cash transactions between numbered accounts and city contractors. Correspondence revealed coded communications between police supervisors and individuals Jake didn't recognize. Meeting schedules indicated regular gatherings that never appeared on official department calendars. One particular document that Rex brought to light made Jake's heart race. It was a memo dated just 3 days ago, bearing Captain Bennett's signature and marked Urgent Containment Protocol Alpha. The memo outlined plans to neutralize the Morrison investigation through temporary isolation and evidence restructuring. The clinical language couldn't disguise what appeared to be instructions for his kidnapping and the destruction of his investigation files. The realization that his own mentor had signed orders for his abduction was devastating. Captain Bennett had been more than just his superior officer. She'd been a friend, someone he'd trusted with his career aspirations and even personal concerns. The thought that she'd been watching him, manipulating him, and ultimately betraying him cut deeper than the physical discomfort of his restraints. Rex's investigation revealed another troubling layer to the conspiracy. Among the photographs were images of meetings between Captain Bennett and individuals Jake recognized as subjects of his corruption investigation. City Councilman Michael Torres, Construction Commissioner Patricia Williams, and Police Chief Robert Hayes were all pictured in what appeared to be clandestine gatherings. The timestamps on the photos showed these meetings had been occurring regularly for over 2 years. The scope of the network was staggering. This wasn't just about a few corrupt officials skimming funds or taking bribes. The materials suggested a coordinated effort to control city contracts, manipulate police investigations, and silence anyone who might threaten their operations. Jake's investigation had apparently come too close to exposing something worth protecting at any cost. As Rex continued his methodical search, he uncovered what appeared to be the most damaging evidence yet. A series of recorded conversations between Captain Bennett and an unidentified male voice discussing the Morrison problem and strategies for containing his investigation. Even without being able to play the recordings, the timestamps and file names made their contents clear. The warehouse suddenly felt smaller, more oppressive, as Jake grasped the full extent of his situation. He wasn't just dealing with a few bad cops or corrupt officials. This was an organized network with resources, planning, and the willingness to kidnap a police detective to protect their interests. The careful documentation suggested they'd been operating for years, possibly decades, building power and influence throughout Detroit's civic structure. Rex's behavior indicated he'd found something else in the hidden compartment, something that triggered his alert training more strongly than the previous discoveries. The German Shepherd's posture became more focused, his movements more urgent, as he worked to extract whatever had caught his attention. When he finally emerged, he was carrying what appeared to be a sealed envelope marked with today's date. The envelope's marking sent a chill through Jake's spine. Final solution, Morrison case, execute upon authorization. The formal language and official appearance suggested this wasn't just evidence of past activities, but active planning for future actions. Whatever was in that envelope likely contained instructions for his permanent disappearance or worse. The sound of footsteps somewhere in the distance made both Jake and Rex freeze. Someone was approaching the warehouse, and from the measured pace and apparent confidence, it wasn't someone stumbling upon their location accidentally. Rex's ears pricked forward, his body tensing as he moved protectively closer to Jake's chair. "Quiet." "Oh boy," Jake whispered urgently. "Stay alert but don't bark unless I tell you." Rex understood the command, settling into a defensive position where he could watch the approaches while remaining relatively hidden among the crates and shadows. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the sound of voices engaged in quiet conversation. Jake couldn't make out specific words, but the tone suggested casual familiarity rather than concern or alarm. Whoever was coming knew this place well and felt comfortable here. The realization that he was about to face his captors sent adrenaline coursing through his system. Rex remained perfectly still, his training overriding his protective instincts as he waited for Jake's signal. The evidence they'd discovered lay scattered around them, proof of corruption and conspiracy that could bring down some of Detroit's most powerful figures. But that evidence would be meaningless if they couldn't escape to share it with honest authorities. As the voices grew clearer, Jake prepared himself for what might be his only chance to understand who was behind his kidnapping and why they were willing to go to such extremes to protect their secrets. The warehouse around them held the answers to questions that had driven his investigation for months. But now those answers might come at a price he wasn't prepared to pay. The footsteps stopped just outside the main entrance to the warehouse. Jake could hear the metallic rattle of keys, followed by the distinct sound of multiple deadbolts being disengaged. Rex remained motionless in his hiding position among the crates, his dark fur helping him blend into the shadows. The evidence they'd uncovered lay scattered around Jake's chair, too close to conceal, but partially obscured by the poor lighting. The heavy door swung open with a prolonged creak, and Jake's heart sank as he recognized the silhouette framed against the dim exterior light. Captain Sarah Bennett stood in the doorway, her familiar figure unmistakable even in shadow. Behind her, Jake could make out at least two other people, their faces hidden but their postures suggesting familiarity with the location. "I told you he'd be awake by now." Captain Bennett's voice carried across the warehouse with the same calm authority Jake had always admired. Detective Morrison has always been particularly resilient. It's one of the qualities that made him so valuable to the department. Jake felt a mixture of rage and heartbreak as his mentor stepped into the warehouse, followed by two men he didn't immediately recognize. The betrayal was complete now, undeniable and devastating. The woman who had guided his career, who had earned his respect and trust over years of working together, was orchestrating his imprisonment. Captain Bennett," Jake called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "I have to admit, I never saw this coming, though I guess that was the point, wasn't it?" She approached his chair with measured steps, her expression unreadable in the dim light. As she drew closer, Jake could see she was dressed in civilian clothes rather than her usual uniform, and she carried a small briefcase that suggested this visit was planned and purposeful. "Jake, I'm truly sorry it had to come to this," she said, and there was genuine regret in her voice. "You were always one of my best detectives. Your thoroughness, your integrity, your inability to let go of a case once you'd sunk your teeth into it. All admirable qualities until they became dangerous ones." "Dangerous to who, Captain? To you, to your little network of corrupt officials." Jake's anger was building despite his vulnerable position. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me, to everyone in the department?" Captain Bennett set her briefcase down on a nearby crate and opened it, revealing additional files and what appeared to be electronic equipment. "Longer than you might think, Jake, and it's not what you believe it is. This isn't about personal enrichment or petty corruption. This is about maintaining stability in a city that was falling apart." One of the men who had accompanied her stepped forward, and Jake recognized him as Assistant District Attorney Marcus Webb. The recognition sent another shock through Jake's system. Webb had been one of the prosecutors he'd worked with most closely, someone he'd considered both competent and honest. The web of betrayal was expanding beyond anything he'd imagined. "And Detective Morrison," Webb said formally, "I want you to understand that nobody wanted things to reach this point. Your investigation was getting close to exposing operations that have been crucial to Detroit's recovery over the past 5 years. Sometimes the greater good requires difficult decisions. The greater good." Jake's voice rose despite his efforts to remain calm. "You kidnapped a police detective. You've been running some kind of shadow operation for years. How exactly does that serve the greater good?" Captain Bennett pulled a chair closer to Jake's position and sat down, adopting the same posture she'd used during countless debriefing sessions over the years. The familiarity of the gesture made the situation even more surreal. "Jake, what you discovered in your investigation was real. There have been irregularities in city contracts, unusual financial arrangements, and yes, some activities that would be difficult to explain in court, but you only saw part of the picture. You didn't see what those activities prevented." She gestured to the third man, who Jake now recognized as City Planning Director Thomas Crawford. Detroit was dying. Jake, budget crises, infrastructure collapse, population flight, rising crime rates. Traditional government channels were too slow, too bureaucratic, too hampered by red tape to address the crisis effectively. We developed alternative methods. "Alternative methods," Jake repeated bitterly. "Is that what you call fraud and conspiracy now?" Crawford stepped forward, his expression earnest. "Detective, 5 years ago, Detroit was on track to become the first major American city to completely collapse. Bankruptcy proceedings were destroying any hope of recovery. We identified key infrastructure projects and economic development opportunities that could turn things around, but the official approval processes would have taken years. So you decided to bypass democracy and the rule of law," Jake said. "How convenient." "We decided to be practical," Captain Bennett replied. "The network you've been investigating has been responsible for accelerating over $2 billion in development projects, creating thousands of jobs, and preventing the complete economic collapse of this city. Yes, we operated outside normal channels. Yes, we used unconventional methods, but the results speak for themselves." Jake stared at his mentor, struggling to process what he was hearing. "And my investigation threatened to expose your alternative methods, so you decided to eliminate the threat." "Not eliminate, Jake. Redirect. Captain Bennett opened one of the files from her briefcase. We've been monitoring your investigation for months, watching as you got closer to uncovering our operations. We've also been preparing an alternative explanation for the irregularities you've discovered. She showed him documents that appeared to be investigation reports, but with different conclusions than what Jake had been developing. A foreign intelligence operation targeting Detroit's infrastructure, evidence of outside interference in city contracts, a national security matter that requires federal involvement and classified handling. You're going to frame this as espionage. Jake couldn't hide his disbelief. We're going to redirect it toward the truth, Webb interjected. There has been foreign interest in Detroit's recovery. Jake, Chinese investors, Russian energy companies, Middle Eastern development funds. Some of those interests weren't entirely legitimate. Our operations weren't just about accelerating development. They were about ensuring that development served American interests. The explanation was sophisticated, Jake had to admit. It provided cover for the irregular activities while positioning the conspirators as patriots rather than criminals, but it also required his cooperation, or at least his silence. "And if I don't agree to your revised version of events?" Jake asked. Captain Bennett's expression hardened slightly. "Then we'll have to consider you a security risk, Jake. Someone whose investigation could compromise ongoing national security operations. Someone who might need to be handled by federal authorities under provisions most people don't know exist." The threat was clear, even couched in bureaucratic language. Jake realized that his discovery of their operations had put him in an impossible position. They couldn't simply release him to continue his investigation, but they also couldn't simply dispose of him without raising questions that would bring unwanted attention. From his hiding place among the crates, Rex remained perfectly still. Jake knew his partner was waiting for a signal, but any aggressive action now would likely result in Rex being hurt or captured. The German Shepherd's presence was his only advantage, and he needed to preserve it for the right moment. "Badim, what exactly are you proposing, Captain?" Jake asked, buying time while he tried to assess his options. "A transfer," she replied, "to a federal task force investigating foreign economic interference. Your investigation skills would be valuable, and your knowledge of Detroit's situation would be classified appropriately. You'd continue your career, just with different oversight and different objectives. And if I refuse?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Jake understood that his choices were limited, but he also noticed something his captors hadn't. In their confidence and familiarity with the warehouse, they hadn't bothered to secure the evidence Rex had uncovered. The documents, recording devices, and files were still scattered around his chair, partially visible in the dim light. More importantly, Rex was still free and undetected. His partner had been trained for exactly these types of situations, and Jake knew the German Shepherd was capable of actions that could change the dynamics of his captivity. The question was whether he could create the right opportunity without putting Rex in unnecessary danger. "I need time to think about this," Jake said finally. "This is a lot to process." Captain Bennett nodded. "Of course it is. We'll give you some time to consider your options. But Jake, understand that time is limited. This situation needs to be resolved quickly before other people start asking questions about your whereabouts." As the three conspirators moved away from his chair to discuss something privately, Jake caught Rex's attention with a subtle hand gesture. His partner's ears perked up slightly, indicating he was ready for instructions. Jake knew this might be his only chance to turn the situation to his advantage, but the timing would have to be perfect. Jake watched as Captain Bennett, Webb, and Crawford huddled near the warehouse entrance, their voices too low for him to make out specific words. Their body language suggested disagreement about how to proceed. Webb appeared to be advocating for something more aggressive, while Crawford seemed hesitant. Captain Bennett stood between them, clearly the decision-maker in this triumvirate of conspirators. During their distraction, Jake used subtle hand signals to communicate with Rex. The German Shepherd had been trained in silent operations, understanding a complex vocabulary of gestures that allowed for coordination without verbal commands. Jake signaled for Rex to move to a position near the warehouse's rear exit, staying hidden but ready for action. Rex acknowledged the command with the slightest movement of his ears before beginning a careful, silent journey through the shadows between the crates. His movement was so quiet that even Jake, who knew exactly where his partner was, could barely track his progress. The German Shepherd's training and natural stealth were paying dividends in this critical moment. "Detective Morrison?" Captain Bennett called out, turning back toward his chair. "But we need to reach a decision tonight. There are other people involved in this situation who are less patient than we are." "Other people?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about how extensive this network had become. "Federal contacts who have been monitoring our operations," she replied. "They're aware of your investigation and its potential impact on ongoing national security matters. If we can't resolve this locally, they'll take jurisdiction, and I can assure you, their methods are less considerate than ours." The threat was becoming clearer. Jake realized he wasn't just dealing with local corruption, but something that had attracted federal attention and protection. The scale of the conspiracy was even larger than the evidence he'd found suggested. Webb stepped forward, checking his watch with obvious impatience. "Captain, we've been generous with our time. Detective Morrison needs to understand that his cooperation isn't really optional. The documentation is already prepared for his transfer to federal custody if necessary." "What documentation?" Jake demanded. Crawford opened his briefcase and pulled out what appeared to be official federal paperwork. "Psychiatric evaluation recommending immediate treatment for stress-induced paranoid episodes. Medical records showing erratic behavior and accusations against fellow officers. A pattern of mental instability that explains your conspiracy theories about department corruption." The sophistication of their backup plan was chilling. They'd been preparing to destroy his credibility and mental health evaluation if he couldn't be co-opted. Jake realized that even if he somehow escaped this warehouse, they'd already laid groundwork to discredit anything he might say about their operations. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" Jake said bitterly. "We've been planning for contingencies since the day you started getting too close to sensitive operations." Captain Bennett replied. "Jake, you were always thorough. We had to be equally thorough in our preparations." As they spoke, Jake noticed that Rex had successfully reached the rear of the warehouse and was investigating what appeared to be an emergency exit. The German Shepherd's behavior suggested he'd found a way out, but Jake needed to create a diversion to take advantage of Rex's discovery. "Captain, I have one question before I make my decision," Jake said, his voice carrying the tone of resignation they wanted to hear. "How long have you been watching me personally? When did you first realize I was getting close to your operations?" Captain Bennett relaxed slightly, interpreting his question as acceptance of his situation. "We first became concerned about 6 months ago when you started cross-referencing contract awards with police incident reports. That correlation analysis was brilliant work, by the way. It showed connections we thought we'd hidden successfully." 6 months, Jake repeated. "So you've been manipulating my investigation from the beginning." "Guiding it," she corrected. "We tried to steer you toward dead ends and false leads. When that didn't work, we had to take more direct action." Webb checked his phone and frowned. "Captain, we have a problem. There's been a development we need to address immediately." "What kind of development?" Crawford asked nervously. "A Detective Morrison's K9 partner hasn't been seen since yesterday evening. Animal Control reported him missing, and there's a search in progress. If that dog leads searchers to this location..." Jake's heart raced. Rex's absence had been noticed, and other officers were looking for him. His partner's tracking abilities were well known throughout the department, and a search for Rex might inadvertently lead to Jake's discovery. Captain Bennett's expression hardened. "Oh, how extensive is the search?" "Limited so far, but it could expand if the dog isn't found soon. We may need to accelerate our timeline." Jake realized this was his moment. The conspirators were distracted by this new development, and their attention was focused on the immediate threat rather than on monitoring him closely. He caught Rex's eye and gave the signal they'd practiced countless times during training exercises. Rex exploded into action from his position near the rear exit. The German Shepherd launched himself toward the group of conspirators with a speed and ferocity that caught them completely off guard. Webb stumbled backward, dropping his phone, while Crawford cried out in alarm and scrambled behind a stack of crates. In the chaos of Rex's attack, Jake threw his weight against his chair, using the distraction to rock it violently from side to side. The old metal chair wasn't designed for such treatment, and after several desperate attempts, one of the legs cracked and gave way. The sudden shift in balance sent Jake tumbling to the concrete floor, but it also loosened his restraints enough for him to work his hands free. "Rex, back!" Jake commanded as he struggled to untie his ankle restraints. His partner immediately disengaged from the confused group and bounded back to Jake's position, providing protective coverage while Jake freed himself. Captain Bennett had drawn her service weapon during the commotion, but she hesitated to use it with Rex positioned between her and Jake. "Detective, you're making this much harder than it needs to be. Stand down and we can still work this out." "Like you worked out my kidnapping," Jake snapped as he finally freed his ankles and scrambled to his feet. "I don't think so." "Captain!" Webb had recovered his composure and was reaching for his own weapon when Rex growled menacingly in his direction. The German Shepherd's intimidating presence was clearly affecting all three conspirators' ability to respond effectively to Jake's escape attempt. "The evidence, Rex!" Jake called out, pointing toward the scattered documents around his former position. "Gather the evidence." His partner immediately understood, beginning to collect the most important documents and devices they'd discovered during their investigation of the warehouse. Rex's training included evidence recovery, and he systematically gathered materials while keeping watch on the three conspirators. Jake used the time to assess their escape options. The rear exit Rex had found was their best chance, but they needed to reach it without getting cornered by the three armed individuals between them and freedom. The warehouse's layout provided some cover, but Jake knew their advantage was temporary. "You can't leave here with that evidence," Captain Bennett called out. "Jake, you don't understand the full implications of what you're interfering with. Those documents represent years of work to save this city." "From my perspective, Captain, they represent years of work to subvert democracy and the rule of law," Jake replied, as he and Rex began moving toward the rear exit. "And I took an oath to uphold the law, not to decide which laws were convenient." Crawford emerged from behind the crates, his face flushed with panic. "Captain, if he gets out of here with that evidence, everything we've built will be destroyed. The federal contacts will disavow any connection to our operations. We'll be left holding responsibility for everything." "I know exactly what's at stake, Thomas," Captain Bennett replied grimly. She raised her weapon, pointing it in Jake's direction. "Detective Morrison, I'm ordering you to stop and return that evidence immediately." Jake froze, calculating distances and options. They were still 20 feet from the rear exit, and Captain Bennett was an excellent marksman. Rex sensed the tension and moved protectively in front of Jake, but that just meant his partner would be in the line of fire. "Captain," Jake said carefully, "shooting a police detective and his K9 partner isn't going to be easy to explain, even with your federal connections." "It will be if you're classified as a security threat who resisted lawful detention," Webb interjected. "The paperwork is already prepared," Detective, your mental health evaluation, your history of paranoid accusations, your violent resistance to legitimate federal authority. The narrative practically writes itself. Jake realized they'd backed him into an impossible corner, but as he looked at his former mentor pointing a gun at him, he also realized something else. Rex had positioned himself between Jake and the conspirators, but he'd also positioned himself perfectly for one of their most advanced tactical maneuvers. "Rex!" Jake called out quietly. "High alert protocol." The German Shepherd's posture immediately shifted into attack readiness, and Jake knew his partner was prepared for whatever came next. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of sirens that seemed to be growing closer. Whether those sirens represented rescue or additional danger, Jake couldn't tell, but he knew his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The sirens grew louder, their wailing echoing through the industrial district and filling the warehouse with an ominous soundtrack to the standoff. Jake watched Captain Bennett's face as she processed the approaching sounds, her expression shifting from confident control to growing concern. The arrival of additional law enforcement wasn't part of her plan. "Those aren't our people," Webb said urgently, checking his phone again. "Captain, we have multiple units responding to this location." Someone called in a disturbance. Crawford's panic was visible now. "How is that possible? This location isn't supposed to be known to regular patrol units." Jake felt a surge of hope. Rex's disappearance had triggered a search that somehow led other officers to this warehouse. His partner's absence from home had set in motion the very rescue operation the conspirators had tried to prevent. "Jake," Captain Bennett called out, her weapon still trained in his direction, "you need to understand what's about to happen. When those officers arrive, they're going to find 3 senior officials trying to prevent a mentally unstable detective from compromising a classified operation. The evidence you think you've found will be reclassified as fabricated materials used to support your paranoid delusions." "Maybe," Jake replied. "It did, but they're also going to find a kidnapped police detective and his partner in an abandoned warehouse with enough documentation to keep internal affairs busy for months. Even your federal contacts won't be able to explain that away easily." The sirens were now close enough that Jake could distinguish individual vehicles, multiple units, possibly including SWAT backup given the report of a missing detective. Rex's ears tracked the approaching sounds with the precision of a finely tuned instrument. "Captain," Webb said desperately, "we need to implement containment protocol immediately. If Morrison's allegations reach the wrong people before we can control the narrative—" "I know what's at stake," Captain Bennett snapped, but Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. The carefully planned operation was unraveling, and the arrival of uncontrolled law enforcement was forcing her into increasingly desperate decisions. Rex suddenly tensed, his attention focused on something beyond the warehouse walls. His behavior indicated the approaching officers were very close, possibly already surrounding the building. Jake knew his partner's ability to detect human presence through multiple barriers, and Rex's alertness suggested they had backup nearby. "You have one chance to do the right thing." "Captain," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned from her own example over the years, "stand down your weapon. Let me walk out of here with the evidence, and maybe we can find a way to minimize the damage to everyone involved." Captain Bennett's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Minimize the damage? Jake, do you have any idea what you're about to destroy? The programs we've implemented have prevented Detroit from becoming a ghost town. The economic development, the infrastructure improvements, the reduction in violent crime rates, all of that goes away if our methods are exposed." "Your methods include kidnapping and conspiracy," Jake replied. "Whatever good you think you've accomplished doesn't justify that." Crawford stepped forward, his desperation making him reckless. "Detective, you're seeing this all wrong. We're not the criminals here. We're the ones who prevented Detroit from completely collapsing. The traditional government channels were too slow, too bureaucratic. We found ways to cut through red tape and make things happen. By circumventing democracy and the rule of law, Jake countered. You decided you knew better than the voters and the system they elected to represent them. The sound of vehicles stopping outside the warehouse was now unmistakable. Car doors slamming, radio chatter, the organized movement of multiple officers taking positions. Rex's tail began to wag slightly, recognizing the sounds and scents of fellow law enforcement officers. "This is Detroit PD," a voice called through a megaphone from outside. "We have the building surrounded. Anyone inside needs to exit with their hands visible immediately." Captain Bennett's face went pale as she recognized the voice. "Obed, that's Lieutenant Rodriguez from Internal Affairs," she whispered to Webb. How did Internal Affairs get involved in this? Jake smiled grimly. Maybe because someone in the department suspected there were problems with Operation Clean Slate and started their own investigation. Or maybe because a decorated detective and his K9 partner disappearing triggered protocols you didn't know about. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Jake. Captain Bennett's own thoroughness in training him and other detectives had created procedures and backup systems that she hadn't fully considered when planning his kidnapping. The department's protocols for missing officers were designed to prevent exactly this kind of internal conspiracy. "Captain Bennett, Detective Morrison, we know you're both inside." Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice called out again. "And we need everyone to exit the building peacefully so we can sort this situation out." Webb drew his weapon, his panic overriding his judgment. "We can't let them take Morrison out of here with that evidence. Everything we've worked for will be destroyed." "Put your weapon down, Marcus," Captain Bennett ordered sharply. "Shooting our way out of this isn't an option." But Crawford was already moving toward Jake's position, apparently planning to grab the evidence Rex had collected. "We have to get those documents back before—" Rex's training took over as Crawford approached aggressively. The German Shepherd lunged forward, not to attack, but to intercept, placing himself directly between Crawford and Jake. The sudden movement startled Crawford, who stumbled backward into a stack of crates, sending several boxes tumbling to the floor with a crash that echoed throughout the warehouse. The noise from inside prompted immediate action from the officers outside. "Move in!" Rodriguez's voice commanded, and Jake could hear the sound of the main entrance being breached. "Everybody freeze!" Multiple voices shouted as tactical officers flooded into the warehouse, their weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the dim interior. "Detroit PD, show me your hands!" Jake immediately raised his hands, calling out, "Detective Jake Morrison. Badge number 4782. I'm the missing officer you've been searching for." Rex moved to Jake's side, his training keeping him calm despite the chaos of multiple armed officers entering their space. The German Shepherd's disciplined behavior helped identify him to the responding officers as a police K9 rather than a threat. Captain Bennett slowly lowered her weapon and raised her hands, her face a mask of resignation and defeat. Webb followed suit, though his expression remained defiant. Crawford raised his hands, but continued protesting loudly about federal authority and classified operations. Lieutenant Rodriguez approached Jake's position carefully, recognizing both Jake and Rex from their years of service together. "Detective Morrison, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine, Lieutenant," Jake replied. But I have evidence of a major corruption conspiracy involving city officials and federal connections. The documents are right here." He gestured to the materials Rex had gathered during their escape attempt. "We'll need to secure all of that as evidence," Rodriguez said, signaling to crime scene technicians who were already moving into the warehouse. "Detective, can you give me a preliminary report on what happened here?" Jake looked at Captain Bennett, who stood in custody with her hands secured behind her back. The woman who had been his mentor and guide throughout his career was now just another suspect in a corruption investigation. The betrayal still stung, But Jake felt a sense of closure, knowing that the truth would finally come out. "It's a long story, Lieutenant," Jake said. But the short version is that Operation Cleanslate was a conspiracy to bypass normal government processes under the guise of emergency economic development. They kidnapped me when my investigation got too close to exposing their methods. Rodriguez nodded grimly. "We've been conducting our own investigation based on some irregularities that came to our attention. Your disappearance was the final piece we needed to move forward with arrests." As crime scene technicians began cataloging the evidence, Jake learned that Internal Affairs had been quietly building a case for months. His investigation had been one of several that pointed toward the same network of corruption, and his disappearance had triggered federal oversight that the conspirators' contacts couldn't prevent. What happens now?" Jake asked, as paramedics checked him for injuries, despite his protests that he was fine. "Now we process the evidence, build our cases, and restore faith in the system," Rodriguez replied. "Detective, your investigation work was exemplary. Even under these circumstances, you managed to gather evidence that will be crucial to prosecuting this conspiracy." Rex received attention from a police department veterinarian who confirmed the German Shepherd was in excellent health despite his unauthorized adventure. The bond between Jake and his partner had been tested under extreme circumstances and had proven unbreakable. Over the following weeks, the evidence Jake and Rex had uncovered led to a comprehensive investigation that exposed the full scope of Operation Cleanslate. While some of the development projects the conspirators had accelerated did benefit Detroit, the methods used violated federal and state laws regarding government contracts and democratic processes. Captain Bennett, Webb, and Crawford were indicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy, kidnapping, and fraud. Their federal contacts disavowed any official connection to their operations, leaving them to face the consequences of their choices alone. Jake returned to duty with a new assignment in Internal Affairs, where his investigation skills and hard-won experience with corruption cases made him invaluable. Rex remained his partner, their bond strengthened by their shared ordeal in the warehouse. The case became a landmark example of how law enforcement officers must remain accountable to the law, regardless of their good intentions. Detroit continued its recovery through legitimate channels, proving that democracy and the rule of law, while sometimes slower than desired, ultimately provide more sustainable solutions than shadowy conspiracies. Jake often reflected on the lessons learned from his betrayal by Captain Bennett. Trust in law enforcement had to be earned through transparency and accountability, not protected through secrecy and manipulation. The badge represented a commitment to serve all citizens equally under the law, not to decide which citizens deserved protection and which laws were worth enforcing. Rex, for his part, seemed to understand that their partnership had evolved through their shared experience. The German Shepherd's loyalty had saved Jake's life and career, proving that some bonds transcend even the most sophisticated betrayals. Dear listeners, we hope Detective Jake Morrison and Rex's story of loyalty, betrayal, and ultimate justice has moved you as much as it moved us. This tale reminds us that even in our darkest moments, truth and integrity can prevail when we have the courage to stand up for what's right. Their partnership shows us the power of unwavering loyalty and the importance of never compromising our values. No matter how convincing the justifications might seem, if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. We bring you new stories every day that explore the complexities of human nature, the bonds that sustain us, and the choices that define who we really are. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear which moment in Jake and Rex's journey affected you most. Don't miss our upcoming stories. And remember, Justice may sometimes be delayed, but it's never truly denied when good people refuse to give up the fight. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth and the strength that comes from doing what's right, even when it's hard.